Hello, I'm Peter Burgess, Professor of Philosophy and AXA Chair in the Geopolitics of Risk at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. In this class, I want to explore the age of risk, from its birth to its impact on our everyday lives, on the way we govern our societies, and on the way we live together. Spoiler alert, not only can we live with risk, but we can also flourish through it. Climate change, pandemics, financial crisis, cyber attacks. Welcome to the new age of risk. It seems as though the world is more dangerous now than it ever was. But in reality, human beings have always lived in relation to danger. And yet, sometime in the course of the late 20th century, that reality changed fundamentally. In 1933, in the face of the extraordinary uncertainty of the Great Depression, US President Franklin Roosevelt famously proclaimed, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Strangely, that is exactly what holds true today. Our new age of risk is not so much an age of new dangers, as it is an age of new fears about danger. Instead of living in the face of risk, we experience life itself as inherently risky. I hold the AXA Chair in the Geopolitics of Risk at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and in this class, I'll tell you how the new age of risk not only requires us to think differently about threats to society, but also to think differently about what it means to live in a society characterized by risk and uncertainty. You may think that risk is a problem of the future. But to understand it, we need to take a brief look at the past. The story of risk begins with the story of security. Over the course of the last centuries, security evolved from a spiritual to an economic, and finally to a military or even civilizational concept. The recent history of security begins with the rise of the Cold War. This unprecedented geopolitical configuration had a distinct impact on the way we understand security today. At any moment between 1945 and around 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was practically impossible to use the word security without immediately evoking national security. And above all, the bipolar axis of security that separated the East and the West. During this period, the word security inevitably conjured the specter of the all-threatening other, the Soviet Union, its military power, its ambitions, and the evil ideas it was said to represent. This two-sided geopolitical image led to the formation of a two-sided imaginary security. It was the logic of us and them. It was almost as though our minds, just like the world itself, had been divided in two, into good and bad, safe, dangerous, right, wrong, beautiful, ugly, free, enslaved, and so on. The odd thing is that our ideas about danger were married to a certain imagined geography of danger. Let me explain. Under the influence of the Cold War mentality, we became convinced that what is dangerous must be out there, far across the national border, far across the ocean. And what is safe, we thought, must be here. What is good, we thought, is within our national borders, and what is bad is far, far away. The border became the symbol for this kind of thinking. And security became a twin exercise of identifying what was threatening and of keeping it far away, preferably on the other side of a border. Thus, the story is told of a farmer interviewed on German radio during the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in the 1980s, who, when asked if he was concerned about the quickly approaching nuclear cloud, replied that there was surely no reason for alarm, since the cloud would not dare cross the German border. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union fundamentally disrupted this way of thinking. With the end of bipolar geopolitics came the end of the monopoly of the bipolar security imaginary. Suddenly, scores of new security concerns appeared. Perhaps they were hidden from us all along. We discovered, for instance, human security, gender security, religious security, ethnic security, climate security, data security, financial security, and I'll spare you the long list. At the same time, we discovered new levels of security, from the personal to the local, to the national, to the regional, from the continental to the global. As a consequence, these new forms of security thinking changed the way we thought about borders. To our surprise and to our unease, we began to discover that borders could no longer protect us. We realized that the dangers of our time are ubiquitous. They are suddenly everywhere. Pandemic, climate change, pollution, data threats, terrorism, they don't respect national borders. Indeed, what is new about these dangers is that they are all around us. A consequence of social life, a symptom of living in the world. So, by the end of the 20th century, it was no longer a question of keeping danger away, but rather of finding a way to live with it. From that moment on, security became less a question of borders and more a question of society. Imagine yourself in a conference room at work. One of your colleagues coughs, politely but distinctly. The email you just received from your boss contains a dubious attachment, and your new intern is sweating profusely and looking nervously and repeatedly at his watch. Are you under threat of pandemic? Computer virus? Terrorism? The reality is that you don't know. And thus we are confronted with our new everyday security reality and its two faces. On the one hand, the threat or the potential threat is part of our everyday lives. Coughing colleagues, suspicious email attachments, bad air, nervous people, this is our normal life. And these activities are not only normal, they're entitled to be there. They are the essence of our modern liberal privilege and entitlement to be ourselves. In other words, this is exactly what we more than once in the last century went to war to defend. On the other hand, these cherished privileges prevent us from knowing what is lurking behind normal activity. We're not even allowed to ask. Dangerous uncertainty is everywhere, and it's a byproduct of the very society we have chosen and fought for. This situation is captured by what we call risk. Risk is the name not of a certainty of future danger, but of its uncertainty. This might strike you as odd, but risk is the science of not knowing. It's the realization that danger is no longer out there, as in the Cold War period. Rather, it is in here, with us, in our societies, in our institutions, in our lives. We say, therefore, that risk is reflexive. It's about us. In order to manage risk, it's not enough to build walls and reinforce borders. We must manage society itself. We must shift our expectations from a society that promises to be risk-free to a society that promises to create the conditions allowing us to live with unavoidable risk. As you can imagine, this is challenging for many reasons. Here are a few. First, risk is associated with freedom. If there were no risk, there would be no freedom. Everything would be known. Everything would be decided. Without uncertainty, there could be no choice. For example, in order to be absolutely sure that our colleague does not have a disease, absolutely everything would have to be known about him or her. No personal freedom would be possible. Second, risk is associated with economic growth. Investment assumes risk. Return on investment is closely calibrated with uncertainty. Third, risk is associated with science. The scientific method means formulating experiments based on uncertain hunches, then testing them. So, without engaging directly with the uncertain, there would be no scientific progress. Finally, risk is associated with the development of the self. Without exploring the unknown on the personal level, we would be robots, repeating again and again what is already known to us. In short, it's clear to see that living today does not mean mastering the unknown, but rather embracing it. One of the great paradoxes of our time is that security measures we put into place to protect us often end up making us more insecure. Just think of the heavily armed military personnel patrolling the railway stations and airports when the risk of violence is heightened. Or perhaps the insistence on plastic screens built around grocery store checkout clerks at the outbreak of the pandemic. These measures may indeed make us more secure. We don't know. And we don't have a way to know, because they are allegedly protecting us against something that hasn't yet happened. They protect us against imagined threats. This doesn't mean that the threats aren't plausible, only that because they haven't become real, they must be imagined. What we do know is that these security measures have the effect of making us more insecure, even if indirectly. We are less sure of what the danger is, but strangely, more sure that we are in danger. Most technologically based security measures have this impact. This is because they reproduce the logic of self and other that we described earlier. They use technological means to separate us from the threat. In doing so, they leave us both very alone and very concerned that the threat will reappear in another way, elsewhere. Professionals describe airport security checks as security theater. They perform the function of providing security for customers, but finish by worrying passengers. I'm sure you can relate to the experience that I often have when traveling through airports. Whenever I pass through the humiliating gauntlet of scans and pat-downs, buzzers and alarms, holding my trousers up with one hand because my belt is removed, dripping shampoo bottle in the other hand, I whisper to myself, the terrorists have won. This is the paradox of technology-based risk management in liberal societies. Only by reducing our personal liberty through security measures can a greater liberty be protected. Technological solutions to risk ultimately don't provide security because they are unable to address the experience of threat, living in the hearts and minds of citizens. They are popular mostly because they are concrete, visible, and above all, accountable to politicians and/or shareholders. In other words, they have all the necessary elements for a good political message. But they're also popular because they play an essential part in the steady growth of the security industry. In the long term, technological measures as an answer to risk is a dead end. As we will see, the most promising alternative lies in society itself. Let me take you back in time. In 2002, on the eve of the US invasion of Iraq, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld held a press conference. Officially, the invasion, which appeared imminent, was justified by the possible presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. When asked about reports contradicting this premise, Secretary Rumsfeld responded in what is now a viral soundbite.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know.
Rumsfeld ended up being wrong about many things, but his analysis of the nature of risks was spot on. He rightly pointed out that there's a difference between two kinds of not knowing. On the one hand, there are real questions that we have not yet answered, the known unknown. And on the other hand, there are questions we have not yet asked, the unknown unknown. Both of these experiences of the unknown are experiences of danger, let's be clear, and yet they are essentially different. The first kind of unknown, where the question of danger is asked but not yet answered, refers to danger we have some familiarity with, danger we know how to address or take measures against. Every year in Japan, for example, school children are prepared for the earthquake that all agree is imminent, but finally unpredictable. They perhaps don't know when or where or even how the danger will arrive, but they know what it will be when it does and what they have to do. The second kind of unknown, where we haven't even imagined what kind of question about danger to ask, refers to purely imagined danger, danger that has no proof, danger that has no reason. These two different kinds of knowledge invite two different kinds of responses, and more importantly, engage two different kinds of politics. The first one leads to political action based on models from past experience. The second one leads us to political action based on imagination. And since imagination is made up of all sorts of inputs, memories, experiences, hopes, fears, fantasies, nightmares, it opens a space for a wide range of sometimes very unexpected politics. The soundbite from Rumsfeld marks the beginning of an era when we are increasingly governed by what we do not know, by uncertainty, and therefore by imagination. We act not because we know what needs to be done, but because we don't know what needs to be done. In the best case, the politics of the unknown unknowns leads to harmless, arbitrary policies. For example, and I'm sure you'll remember, the famous 1-kilometer perimeter imposed here in France, where I live, during the first COVID-19 lockdown. In other cases, it leads to harmful, prejudicial, detrimental, even dangerous policies. For example, watch lists based on religion or race, intrusive surveillance practices, or blanket suspension of civil rights. You would be right to think that the age of risk is fundamentally political. Uncertainty is quickly transformed into diverging lines of political action. Policies based on hair-thin evidence or on the flimsiest of suspicions can have wide-ranging impacts on society. In order to successfully face risk, we need to make peace with uncertainty. So we've talked a lot about risk. But what does risk mean in practical terms? Risk is a practice, the practice of organizing knowledge, values, perceptions, and material resources in response to perceived threats. In other words, risk is not the same as danger. Risk is not a fact. It's not an identifiable threat, something that is pending, something that lies in the future. Let's remember that danger is understood as something bad that has not yet happened. It's something we have to imagine. And you can be sure that a lot of political energy goes into arguing about what we should imagine. How likely is the threat? We don't know. How bad is it? We don't know. That's because both of these questions depend on who we are, what is important to us, what kind of lives we lead, and what values we hold dear. A threat is only a threat to something we value. Indeed, there can be no threat to something we don't care about. In the same way, the likelihood of danger is subjective, determined by how we experience security, time, and the unknown. Some find uncertainty appealing, skydivers and rock climbers. Others find it unbearable. In short, if we already said that risk is political, it's also cultural. Risk is a mirror on ourselves of who we are. It reflects our experience of the past and our aspirations for the future. It draws upon our own individual experience and the experience of others. It reflects what we know, but also forces us to relate what we don't know. It even engages the frontier between faith and reason. We can handle financial crisis, computer attacks, pandemics, even climate change if only we know what is happening and what will happen. It's not these problems themselves that cause political chaos in the age of risk. Rather, it's the uncertainty around them. It's the unease and the fear, the mistrust and anxiety that are caused by not knowing. It's these things that cause turmoil in society. It's the fact that we simply can't deal with the unknown. Again, risk doesn't mean mastering the unknown. That would be impossible. Rather, it means living with danger. It means developing a society of trust and solidarity in the presence of uncertainty, even when uncertainty can be the most powerful cause of societal division. The key lies in society's resilience. On a cold and dark winter night in 2014 in Lardal, Norway, population 2,117, a small kitchen fire in a wooden house quickly engulfed most of the structures in the village. No life was lost, but over 60 structures were ultimately damaged or destroyed. The fire department was quick to arrive, but failures in the power grid and the mobile phone network left firefighters helpless, unable to pump water from nearby river or to find alternative water sources. Unexpectedly, as the local residents woke to the blaze, they themselves were able to repair pumps and guide rescuers to private and lesser-known sources of water, saving the village from catastrophe. What does this story teach us? The lesson is this: those who are best equipped to manage a crisis are those closest to it. Even technologically advanced, well-organized and centralized rescue professionals were helpless in the face of a local crisis, in desperate need of local knowledge. This is an example of what is called societal resilience. It's the idea that hidden, or sometimes neglected, assets and strengths of individuals and local groups in society may be the best resources for addressing the challenges of the new era of risk. But how can we harness this idea in practice? Well, first by raising awareness of the skills, knowledge, and competence implicit in local populations. It means connecting the unique, informal expertise that lies hidden in the cultures, values, traditions, and practices of local societies. Then, there's a range of concrete ways of doing this. Most are based on creating links between those who have competence in certain areas and those who need that competence the most. This means, for example, creating services and institutions that link different sectors of society through shared exercises and information campaigns. Introducing digital communication services that connect people through social media, text warnings, and public service announcements. Sharing best practices between first responders and local communities. Adapting first response services based on community feedback. Or encouraging private insurers to tailor products to local conditions. Common to all these methods is the insight that the key to addressing the challenge of risk is the realization that society itself is the best resource. In short, societal resilience can be nurtured by recognizing and addressing the deeply interlinked and thus interdependent nature of contemporary society. The ties that bind are the ties that protect.